March 8, 1965. Red Beach 2, Da Nang, South Vietnam. Aero 903 hours. The first wave of the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade splashed ashore under a cloudless sky. 3,500 Marines, full combat gear, M14 rifles at the ready. They expected gunfire. They got cameras. Vietnamese girls in AO-dyed dresses placed leis around their necks. Reporters from CBS, NBC, and ABC filmed the landing as if it were a parade. South Vietnamese officials smiled for photographs. One Marine from Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, later wrote home, "We thought we were hitting Iwo Jima. Instead, we got a beauty pageant." Major General Lewis Walt, commander of the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force, stepped onto the sand with the confidence of a man who believed this would be brief. He had fought at Guadalcanal, at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima. He knew what Marines could do. The mission was simple: security duty for the Da Nang Air Base. Defensive perimeter only. No offensive operations. 18-month rotation, maximum. None of it was true. Within 6 months, Marines would be running search and destroy missions deep into the Khe Sanh Valley. Within a year, they would be dying at rates not seen since the Korean War. Within 3 years, the 3rd Marine Division would suffer more casualties than any Marine division since World War II. The flowers wilted in the heat. The cameras left. The girls went home. What remained was the jungle. And the jungle had been waiting. By nightfall on March 8th, the perimeter was established. Sandbags stacked. Machine gun nests positioned. Trip flares set. The Marines dug in, and in the distance, beyond the wire, beyond the tree line, the war that would break them had already begun. They were 19 years old on average. They had trained for 13 weeks at Paris Island or San Diego. They had been taught to shoot, to march, to obey. They had been told they were the finest fighting force on earth. What they had not been told was this: that the enemy would never fight the way they were trained to fight, that the jungle would kill as efficiently as any bullet, that 13 months in Vietnam would feel like 13 years, that some of them would never leave, and that those who did would carry Vietnam inside them for the rest of their lives. This is the ugly truth of being a combat Marine in Vietnam. They trained for the wrong war. At Camp Pendleton, at Camp Lejeune, at Quantico, Marine infantrymen learned to assault fortified positions, to flank enemy battalions, to call in artillery on grid coordinates. They practiced amphibious landings, frontal assaults, coordinated fire and maneuver. They studied the island-hopping campaigns of World War II. They memorized the lessons of the Cho Sin Reservoir. Vietnam had none of that. The enemy did not hold ground. The enemy did not wear uniforms. The enemy did not fight at noon. Lance Corporal Michael Herr, later a combat correspondent, described his first week in country. You could be in the most hostile place in the world and still not see a single enemy soldier. But you knew they were there. You could feel them. And then someone would step on a mine. Booby traps. The phrase does not capture the horror. Punji stakes, sharpened bamboo, often smeared with human feces, hidden in shallow pits along trails. A Marine would step through and the stake would pierce his boot, his foot, his calf. Infection would follow. Medevac if he was lucky. Gangrene if he was not. Toe poppers, small blast mines, pressure detonated, designed not to kill, but to maim. They would take a foot, sometimes a leg below the knee. The Viet Cong calculated that a wounded Marine required 2 more Marines to carry him, plus a medevac helicopter, plus a surgical team. 1 mine could remove 4 men from the battlefield. Grenades rigged to tripwires, mortar shells buried nose up, detonated by a footfall. 105 mm artillery shells wired to pressure plates. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army turned American ordnance into American casualties. The numbers were staggering. Between 1965 and 1970, booby traps and mines accounted for 11% of all Marine deaths and 17% of all Marine wounds. In some units, the percentage was higher. In the 3rd Marine Division, operating near the DMZ, mines and traps caused 65% of casualties during certain operations. Walking Point, being the first man in the patrol, became a death sentence negotiation. Units rotated the duty. Some Marines volunteered, believing that their heightened alertness would save them. Others were assigned. In either case, the life expectancy of a point man in heavy contact zones was measured in weeks. Corporal Robert Peterson, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, wrote in his diary on April 14, 1966, "Today was my third day on point. I have never been so afraid in my life. Every step could be the last. You look for disturbed soil, for tripwires, for anything that doesn't belong, but the jungle all looks the same, and they are so much better at this than we are." Peterson survived his tour. He lost his left leg on day 4. The training had promised clarity. Find the enemy, fix the enemy, destroy the enemy. Vietnam offered none of that. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. A farmer by day could be a guerrilla by night. A village that seemed peaceful could be a Viet Cong stronghold. Children could be spotters. Women could carry grenades. Marines were taught to trust their instincts. But in Vietnam, instincts failed. Lieutenant Philip Caputo, 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines, later wrote, "We learned that the only thing we could trust was that we could not trust anything." The first month was the deadliest. New Marines, fresh from the States, did not know the jungle. They made noise. They moved too fast. They did not recognize the signs. Veteran Marines called them FNGs, fucking new guys, and kept their distance because getting attached to an FNG was a waste of emotion. Operation Starlight, August 18 to 24, 1965, was the first major Marine ground operation. Objective: destroy the 1st Viet Cong Regiment on the Van Tuong Peninsula. The Marines expected a quick victory. They got 45 killed and 203 wounded. The Viet Cong lost an estimated 614, but they melted back into the villages, indistinguishable from civilians. Major General Walt declared it a success. The Marines on the ground knew better. By the end of 1965, the 3rd Marine Division had suffered 1,400 casualties. The war was 9 months old for the Marines. It would last 8 more years, and the real nightmare had not even begun. The numbers do not lie. The numbers never lie. Between 1965 and 1973, the United States Marine Corps sent approximately 450,000 Marines to Vietnam. Of those, 13,095 were killed in action. Another 88,594 were wounded seriously enough to require medevac. That is a casualty rate of 22.6%. Nearly 1 in 4 Marines who served in Vietnam was either killed or wounded. Compare that to the United States Army: 38,224 killed out of roughly 2.7 million deployed. A casualty rate of approximately 4.9%. The Marine Corps, with a fraction of the Army's manpower, absorbed nearly a third of the casualties. Why? Geography, mission, doctrine. The Marines were assigned I Corps, the 5 northernmost provinces of South Vietnam: Quang Tri, Thua Tien, Quang Nam, Quang Tin, Quang Ngai. This was not the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta. This was not the Central Highlands where the Army operated. This was the DMZ, the most heavily fortified, most violently contested real estate in the entire war. The DMZ demilitarized zone was a bitter joke. Established by the 1954 Geneva Accords, it was supposed to be a buffer between North and South Vietnam. Instead, it became a killing field. The North Vietnamese Army used it as a highway for infiltration. They dug tunnels beneath it. They built bunkers along it. They placed artillery in the mountains above it and rained shells on Marine positions below. Con Thien, Gio Lien, Dong Ha, Camp Carroll. These were not bases. They were targets. Con Thien, Hill of Angels, was a combat base 3 kilometers south of the DMZ. Between September and October 1967, the North Vietnamese Army fired more than 3,000 artillery shells and rockets at Con Thien. Marines lived in bunkers, unable to stand upright for weeks. Resupply came only by helicopter, and helicopters were shot down regularly. The base was surrounded. Patrols sent beyond the wire were ambushed. The official casualty count for the siege of Con Thien: 178 Marines killed, over 700 wounded. Unofficial counts were higher. Some bodies were never recovered. Then there was Khe Sanh, January 21st to July 9th, 1968. 77 days of siege. The 26th Marine Regiment, approximately 6,000 Marines, defended a remote plateau near the Laotian border. The North Vietnamese surrounded them with an estimated 20,000 troops. Artillery, rockets, and mortars struck the base daily. The comparison to Dien Bien Phu, the French defeat that ended their war in Indochina, was impossible to ignore. The Marines held, but the cost was brutal. Official casualties: 274 Marines killed, 2,541 wounded. Unofficial estimates, including Special Forces and South Vietnamese troops at surrounding outposts, pushed the death toll over 1,000. General William Westmoreland called it a victory. The Marines who were there called it survival. Hue City, January 31st to March 3rd, 1968. The Tet Offensive brought the war into Vietnam's ancient imperial capital. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong occupied the city. The Marines were ordered to take it back. House by house, room by room. 26 days of urban warfare. The 1st and 5th Marine Regiments lost 142 killed and 857 wounded. They fired over 18,000 rounds of artillery into a city filled with civilians. They called in airstrikes on cultural landmarks. The Citadel, an 18th century fortress, was reduced to rubble. When it was over, an estimated 10,000 civilians were dead or missing. Mass graves were found later. The Viet Cong had executed thousands: teachers, civil servants, anyone associated with the South Vietnamese government. But it was the Marines who were shown on television, firing into buildings, throwing grenades into homes. It was the Marines who became the face of American brutality, and it was the Marines who knew the truth. They had been sent into a medieval fortress with modern weapons and told to win without destroying it. An impossible mission. The weight they carried made it worse. The standard combat load for a Marine infantryman in Vietnam: M16 rifle, 7.5 pounds, 400 rounds of ammunition, 12 pounds, 2 canteens, 4 pounds, entrenching tool, 2 pounds, helmet, 3 pounds, flak jacket, 8 pounds, pack with sea rations, poncho, extra socks, cleaning kit, 20 pounds, grenades, 2 to 4 pounds, claymore mine, 3.5 pounds. Total, 60 to 80 pounds, in heat that averaged 95 degrees Fahrenheit, in humidity that exceeded 90%. In jungle so thick that visibility was measured in feet, not yards. Marines did not march in Vietnam. They staggered. And the joke, bitter, repeated endlessly, was this: the Marine Corps builds men. Vietnam buries them. By the end of 1968, the 3rd Marine Division had been in Vietnam for 3 years. It had rotated tens of thousands of Marines through its ranks. It had fought in more major operations than any other division, and it had suffered 7,012 killed in action. The war was not even half over. Private First Class Richard Allen Marks, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, wrote his last letter on February 14, 1966. He was 20 years old. He had been in Vietnam for 4 months. He would be dead in 2 days. The letter was found in his pack after he was killed by a sniper near Chu Lai. His mother received it 3 weeks later. It read, "Dear Mom, I hope you are well. I hope Dad is feeling better. I hope Susie is doing good in school. I am fine. Do not worry about me. The food is bad, but I have eaten worse at boot camp. The heat is terrible, but I am getting used to it. We went on patrol yesterday. Nothing happened. That is usually how it goes. Nothing, 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 and then everything at once. I cannot explain it better than that. Some of the guys have been here longer. They say it gets easier. I do not think it does. I think they are just better at lying to themselves. I miss you. I will be home before you know it. Love, Richard." He was one of 13,095. Letters were the only connection to what Marines called the world, everything that was not Vietnam. Letters took 2 weeks to arrive from the States. By the time a Marine received news from home, it was already ancient history. Babies had been born, girlfriends had left, parents had grown older, and the Marine reading the letter was no longer the person who had left. Corporal Ron Kovich, 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, later wrote in his memoir, Born on the 4th of July, "I read letters from my mother, and I could not remember who she was talking about. She wrote about neighbors, about family dinners, about the weather, and I thought, how can she write about the weather? How can any of that matter?" Kovic was paralyzed from the chest down on January 20th, 1968, during his second tour. A bullet severed his spinal cord. He was 21 years old. The gap between the world and Vietnam was unbridgeable. Sergeant Robert Mason, a helicopter pilot, described it. You could not explain it to anyone who had not been there. If you tried, they looked at you like you were crazy. So you stopped trying. Some letters were never sent. Marines wrote them and kept them in their packs, intending to mail them later. When they were killed, the letters were returned to their families. These were the most devastating. They were snapshots of a mind preparing for death. Lance Corporal Michael O'Donnell, a medevac helicopter pilot, wrote a poem titled "If You Are Able" in January 1970. It was found in his personal effects after his helicopter was shot down on March 24, 1970 in Cambodia. His body was not recovered until 2001. The poem ends, "If you are able, save for them a place inside of you, and save one backward glance when you are leaving for the places they can no longer go. Be not ashamed to say you loved them, though you may or may not have always. Take what they have left and what they have taught you with their dying, and keep it with your own. And in that time when men decide and feel safe to call the war insane, take one moment to embrace those gentle heroes you left behind." Then there were the letters that demanded the truth. Corporal James Webb, 5th Marines, who would later become a United States Senator and Secretary of the Navy, wrote to his brother in 1969, "Do not believe what you see on television. Do not believe the protesters. We are not baby killers. We are not monsters. We are 19-year-old kids doing what our country asked us to do, and our country does not give a damn about us." The bitterness was widespread. By 1969, Marines in the field had stopped believing in the mission. They no longer fought for victory. They fought to survive. They fought for the man next to them. Lieutenant Philip Caputo, reflecting years later, said, "We did not fight for democracy. We did not fight for freedom. We fought because we were there, and if we did not fight, we would die." One letter, written by an anonymous Marine and published in the New York Times in 1970, became infamous. It was titled, "A Letter from a Grunt," and it described the reality of combat without euphemism. "Yesterday we burned a village. We were told there were Viet Cong there. We found old men, women, children. We burned it anyway. Orders. Today we walked through a valley and lost 3 men to booby traps. We never saw the enemy. We never fired a shot. Tomorrow we will do it again, and the day after, and the day after, until we go home or until we die. I do not know which will come first. I do not know which I prefer." The world did not want to hear it, so the Marines stopped writing. I Corps was not one war, it was 5 wars, fought simultaneously in 5 provinces, each with its own geography, its own enemy, its own nightmare. Quang Tri Province, the northernmost province bordering the DMZ. This was conventional warfare. The North Vietnamese Army operated here in division strength, thousands of troops, supported by artillery, armor and anti-aircraft guns positioned across the border. The Marines were not hunting guerrillas in Quang Tri. They were fighting a modern army. The battles here had names that became synonymous with slaughter: Con Tien, Gio Lin, Dong Ha, Khe San. These were fixed positions, surrounded by minefields, pounded by artillery, resupplied only by helicopter. The Marines called it the meat grinder. Patrols sent beyond the wire rarely returned intact. In July 1967, Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, was ambushed near Con Thien. Of the 187 Marines in the company, 84 were killed and 53 wounded in less than 3 hours. The survivors called it the Day of Reckoning, Thua Thien Province, home to Hue City, the ancient imperial capital. This was urban warfare, politically sensitive, culturally complex. When the Tet Offensive exploded on January 31, 1968, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong occupied Hue. The Marines had to take it back without destroying it, an impossible order. For 26 days they fought building by building, room by room. The enemy used civilians as shields. The Marines had to choose, risk their own lives to minimize civilian casualties, or level the city to save it. They chose survival. By the time Hue was retaken, 80% of the city was destroyed. The psychological toll on the Marines was immense. Sergeant Alfredo Gonzalez, who earned the Medal of Honor posthumously during the battle, was killed while leading an assault on a fortified enemy position. His citation noted that he unhesitatingly continued to expose himself to the heavy enemy fire to save his men. He was 21 years old. Quang Nam Province, the most populous province in I Corps, home to Da Nang, the largest American base in Vietnam. This was counterinsurgency warfare. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Villages were infiltrated. The Viet Cong recruited at night and disappeared by day. Marines conducted pacification operations, entering villages, searching for weapons, interrogating civilians. The line between combatant and non-combatant was invisible. Frustration bred atrocities. In 1966, Marines from the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, systematically burned villages in the Quai Son Valley after suffering casualties from booby traps. No formal charges were filed. The reasoning was simple. If every village was a potential Viet Cong safe house, then every village was a target. Quang Tin Province, the A Shau Valley, the Valley of Death. This was the Ho Chi Minh Trail's southern terminus, the logistics hub for North Vietnamese operations in I Corps. The jungle was triple canopy, so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. The North Vietnamese had built bunkers, tunnels, supply depots, hospitals. When Marines entered the A Shau, they were walking into prepared defenses. Operation Hastings, July 1966. Operation Prairie, August-October 1966. Operation Dewey Canyon, January-March 1969. The casualty rates were staggering. In Dewey Canyon alone, 130 Marines were killed and 920 wounded. The North Vietnamese lost an estimated 1617, but they returned. They always returned. Quang Ngai Province. My Lai was here. On March 16, 1968, Army soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, massacred over 500 civilians in the village of My Lai. It was not a Marine operation, but the Marines operated in the same province, in the same conditions, under the same pressures. The assumption that every village was hostile, the terror of booby traps, the frustration of an invisible enemy. My Lai was an atrocity, but it was also a symptom. The province was a free-fire zone, meaning anything that moved could be engaged. Marines in Quang Ngai burned villages, called in airstrikes on suspected Viet Cong positions, and treated civilians with suspicion bordering on hostility. Some Marines committed war crimes. Some Marines reported war crimes. Most Marines simply tried to survive. By 1969, the Marines had been fighting in I Corps for 4 years. They had pacified villages that were re-infiltrated within weeks. They had taken hills that were abandoned immediately after. They had won every major battle and gained no strategic ground. Corporal William Earhart, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, later wrote, "We took the same hill 5 times. We lost men every time, and every time we left the enemy came back. It was madness, and we knew it was madness. But we kept doing it because those were the orders." I Corps was not the exception. I Corps was the rule. The war had no front lines, no rear areas, no safe zones. The entire country was the battlefield, and the Marines were bleeding everywhere. January 30th, 1968. Tet Nguyen Dan, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. A ceasefire had been declared. Marines at Quai Son, at Hue, at Da Nang, at Phu Bai, relaxed. Some wrote letters, some played cards, some slept. At 01:30 hours on January 31st, the ceasefire ended. 84,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops attacked more than 100 cities, towns, and military installations across South Vietnam. It was the largest coordinated offensive of the entire war. The objective: ignite a general uprising, collapse the South Vietnamese government, destroy American will to continue the war. It failed. But it worked. For the Marines, Tet was two simultaneous catastrophes: the siege of Khe Sanh and the battle for Hue City. Khe Sanh had been under pressure since January 21st. The 26th Marine Regiment, reinforced by artillery and air support, defended a remote plateau surrounded by mountains. The North Vietnamese encircled the base with an estimated 20,000 troops. They dug trenches, positioned artillery, and launched human wave assaults. The comparison to Dien Bien Phu, the 1954 French defeat, haunted General William Westmoreland. He was determined not to lose Khe Sanh. He committed the full weight of American air power. Between January 21 and April 8, 1968, the United States dropped more than 100,000 tons of bombs around Khe Sanh, more than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. B-52 bombers struck every 3 hours. Tactical air support flew 300 sorties per day. The ground shook constantly. Marines inside the perimeter could not distinguish between incoming and outgoing fire. They lived in bunkers, covered in red mud, surrounded by rats. Resupply came by air, C-130 cargo planes that landed under fire, unloaded in seconds, and took off before they could be destroyed. Some planes never made it. On February 10th, a C-130 carrying fuel was hit on approach. It exploded on the runway, killing all aboard and destroying several tons of ammunition. The siege lasted 77 days. When it was lifted on April 8th, the official casualty count was 274 Marines killed, 2,541 wounded. The base was abandoned 2 months later. The Marines had held Khe Sanh at enormous cost and then walked away. No strategic value, no lasting presence, just blood and scrap metal. At the same moment, 200 kilometers to the east, Hue City exploded. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong infiltrated Hue during the Tet ceasefire. By dawn on January 31st, they controlled most of the city. They raised the National Liberation Front flag over the citadel, the ancient imperial fortress. They executed South Vietnamese officials, teachers, clergy, anyone associated with the government. Estimates of the dead ranged from 2,800 to over 6,000. Mass graves were discovered later, bodies bound and shot. The Marines were ordered to retake Hue, but rules of engagement prohibited the destruction of the city's cultural landmarks. No heavy artillery, no airstrikes on the citadel. The Marines would have to fight with rifles, machine guns, and grenades. Lieutenant General Robert Cushman, commander of the 3 Marine Amphibious Force, later admitted, "We sent them into a meat grinder with one hand tied behind their backs." The 1st and 5th Marine Regiments entered Hue on February 1st. They were immediately pinned down. The North Vietnamese had fortified every building. Snipers fired from windows. Machine guns covered every intersection. Rockets struck Marine positions from hidden launchers. The fighting was room to room, floor to floor, wall to wall. Sergeant Alfredo Gonzalez, leading a platoon from Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, was killed on February 4th while assaulting a fortified building. He had exposed himself to enemy fire to direct his Marines, to pull wounded men to safety, to throw grenades into enemy positions. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. His citation read, "By his indomitable courage, inspiring leadership, and selfless devotion to duty, he upheld the highest traditions of the Marine Corps and the United States Naval Service." He was one of 142 Marines killed in Hue. Another 857 were wounded. The battle lasted 26 days. When it was over, the citadel was a ruin. The city was shattered. An estimated 10,000 civilians were dead or missing, and America watched it all on television. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted newsman in America, visited Hue after the battle. On February 27, 1968, he delivered his editorial. "To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic yet unsatisfactory conclusion. President Lyndon Johnson reportedly said after watching the broadcast, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Tet was a military victory. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were decimated. They failed to hold a single city. The general uprising never occurred. But Tet shattered the illusion. America saw what victory looked like in Vietnam: burning cities, dead Marines, endless fighting. And America asked, "What are we fighting for?" The Marines knew the answer: survival. The war did not end after Tet. It accelerated. Richard Nixon was inaugurated on January 20, 1969. His campaign promise: peace with honor. His strategy: Vietnamization, transferring combat responsibility to the South Vietnamese army while gradually withdrawing American troops. It sounded reasonable. It was a lie. For the Marines still in I Corps, Vietnamization meant nothing. The North Vietnamese were not withdrawing. The fighting did not decrease. The casualties continued. Operation Dewey Canyon, January 22 to March 18, 1969. The 9th Marine Regiment, reinforced by elements of the 3rd Marines, pushed into the A Shau Valley and across the border into Laos. The objective: disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The reality: a 56-day meat grinder. The terrain was impossible. Mountains rose at 70-degree angles. The jungle was triple canopy, impenetrable except by machete. Rain fell constantly. Resupply helicopters could not land. They hovered while Marines clung to skids and kicked out ammunition and sea rations. The North Vietnamese defended every ridge, every trail, every bunker complex. The Marines took the high ground: Hill 1228, Hill 1044, Hill 1175. They called in airstrikes, artillery, napalm. They advanced meter by meter. And the North Vietnamese counterattacked every night. Casualties mounted. On February 22nd, Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines was ambushed on a ridgeline. 14 Marines were killed in the opening volley. The survivors fought for 8 hours before reinforcements arrived. On March 3rd, Hotel Company, 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines was pinned down by mortar fire. The company commander, Captain Donald Ryder, called artillery on his own position to break the attack. He survived. 11 of his Marines did not. When Operation Dewey Canyon ended, the official tally was 130 Marines killed, 920 wounded. The North Vietnamese lost an estimated 1,617. Tons of weapons, ammunition, and supplies were captured, and within weeks, the North Vietnamese were back. Then came Hamburger Hill. May 10, 1969. Not a Marine operation, it was the Army's 101st Airborne. But the lesson was universal. Hill 937, near the Laotian border, was a fortified North Vietnamese position. The Army assaulted it 11 times over 10 days. They took 70 killed and 372 wounded. When they finally took the hill, they abandoned it 2 weeks later. No strategic value, just blood. The backlash was immediate. Senators, journalists, and the public demanded answers. Why were American soldiers dying for hills that were abandoned immediately after being taken? The phrase Hamburger Hill became a symbol of the war's futility. The Marines had been asking the same question for years. By 1969, morale was collapsing. Drug use in I Corps skyrocketed. In 1967, fewer than 2% of Marines in Vietnam reported using marijuana. By 1969, the number was over 30%. Heroin, easily obtained in Vietnamese cities, became epidemic. Marines who had fought at Hue, at Khe Sanh, at Con Thien, returned for second and third tours and found a different war. The mission was no longer victory. It was survival until the withdrawal date. Fragging, the murder of officers and NCOs by their own men, became a crisis. In 1969, there were 126 confirmed fragging incidents across all services in Vietnam. In 1970, the number rose to 271. In 1971, It peaked at 333. Most involved fragmentation grenades, hence the name. A grenade rolled into an officer's tent. No witnesses, no evidence, just a dead lieutenant and a platoon that would not go on patrol. The reasons varied. Some officers were incompetent, sending men on pointless patrols. Some were aggressive, demanding body counts when body counts no longer mattered. Some were simply unlucky, assigned to units that had stopped believing. Combat refusals began in 1970. Marines, ordered to assault a fortified position or to conduct a night patrol, simply refused. Entire squads, sometimes entire platoons, said no. Courts-martial followed, but the refusals continued. The war was ending, and no one wanted to be the last man killed in Vietnam. Corporal Robert B. Muller, 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines, was paralyzed on April 29, 1969, when a bullet severed his spinal cord during a firefight. He later said, "We were still dying, still fighting, still losing legs and arms and minds, and for what? So Nixon could negotiate a better surrender? We knew we were not winning. We knew we were leaving, and we kept dying anyway." By the end of 1969, the 3rd Marine Division had been withdrawn from Vietnam. The 1st Marine Division remained, but its role was increasingly defensive. The Marines were no longer taking hills. They were guarding bases. They were counting the days. The meat grinder had not stopped. It had simply become more efficient, and the men fed into it knew they were being sacrificed for a war their country had already decided to lose. They called it the 1,000-yard stare. A Marine could be sitting in a mess hall eating sea rations, surrounded by other Marines, and his eyes would be somewhere else. Not focused on anything, not blinking, just staring into a distance that no one else could see. It was the look of a man who had seen too much, who had carried too many body bags, who had written too many letters to mothers, who had stopped believing that any of this mattered. Combat fatigue, shell shock, battle fatigue, operational exhaustion. The military had a dozen names for it, but the Marines had a simpler term: the breaking. It happened to everyone eventually. Some broke after a week, some after 6 months. Some held together for their entire 13-month tour and broke the moment they stepped off the plane in California. But everyone broke. The symptoms were predictable: insomnia, hypervigilance, irritability, emotional numbness. A Marine who had been calm under fire would lose his temper over a spilled canteen. A Marine who had laughed with his squad would go silent for days. A Marine who had been a leader would stop making decisions, paralyzed by the certainty that every choice led to someone's death. The Marine Corps had no formal system for addressing psychological trauma. There were no therapists in the field, no mental health evacuations. If a Marine was not physically wounded, he stayed in the fight. The unofficial treatment was alcohol, cigarettes, and dark humor. Marines joked about death constantly. They named their rifles. They sang obscene songs about dying. They laughed when they should have cried, because crying meant admitting you were broken. And if you were broken, you were useless. Lieutenant Karl Marlantes, 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, later described it in his memoir, What It Is Like to Go to War. You shut down. You stop feeling, because if you feel, you will go insane. You see your friend's legs blown off, and you do not cry. You do not scream. You call for a medevac, you apply a tourniquet, and you keep moving. Later, maybe years later, you will feel it. But in the moment, you feel nothing. The drugs helped. By 1970, marijuana was ubiquitous in Marine units. Soldiers and Marines smoked openly in the rear areas. Officers looked the other way because the alternative, constant discipline, was worse. Marijuana calmed the fear. It dulled the rage. It made sleep possible. Heroin was different. Heroin erased everything. By 1971, an estimated 10 to 15% of American troops in Vietnam had used heroin. It was cheap, pure, and readily available. Vietnamese children sold it near base perimeters. Bars in Da Nang and Saigon sold it openly. Marines who had never touched drugs in the States became addicts in Vietnam. The military called it an epidemic. The Marines called it a solution. Some never used drugs. Some never drank. but they broke in other ways. Private First Class Michael DeLeo, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, stopped talking on his 180th day in country. He had been walking point when his best friend stepped on a mine. The friend lost both legs and bled out before the medevac arrived. DeLeo carried him to the landing zone covered in blood, screaming for the medics to hurry. The medics could not save him. After that, DeLeo went silent. He obeyed orders. He fired his weapon when necessary, but he did not speak. His platoon sergeant tried to get him evacuated. The battalion surgeon examined him, found no physical injury, and sent him back to the field. DeLeo finished his tour without saying a word. When he returned to the States, his family thought he would recover. He didn't. He shot himself in 1973. He was 23 years old. The mission itself had become meaningless. In 1965, Marines believed they were stopping communism. By 1969, they believed they were surviving. In 1971, they believed they were waiting to leave. Orders that once made sense, take that hill, clear that village, hold that position, now seemed absurd. The ground they took was abandoned. The villages they cleared were re-infiltrated. The positions they held were turned over to South Vietnamese forces who would lose them within weeks. Sergeant Ryan Causey, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, wrote in 1971, "We are not fighting to win anymore. We are fighting so that politicians can say we did not lose. We are dying so that Nixon can say he achieved peace with honor. But there is no honor in this. There is no honor in being the last man killed in a war everyone knows is over." The combat refusal incidents of 1970 and 1971 were not mutinies. They were decisions. Marines, ordered to patrol into known ambush zones or to assault fortified positions, calculated the risk and refused. Some were court-martialed, some were reassigned. Most were simply left alone because disciplining an entire platoon was impossible. The breakdown of discipline was not universal. Elite units, reconnaissance, force recon, some infantry battalions, maintained cohesion until the end. But the average Marine infantry unit in 1971 was a shadow of what it had been in 1966. The men were younger, less trained, more cynical. They wore peace symbols on their helmets. They painted anti-war slogans on their flak jackets. They refused haircuts. They ignored salutes. And the officers stopped caring, because they were leaving too. By 1971, the transformation was complete. The Marines had entered Vietnam as believers. They left as survivors. The mission had broken them. The war had broken them. And America, watching from a distance, had no idea what it had done to them. The last Marine ground combat units withdrew from Vietnam on April 14, 1971. The 1st Marine Division boarded transport ships at Da Nang and sailed away. The base they left behind would fall to the North Vietnamese 4 years later. But for the Marines, the war was over. Except it wasn't. Corporal Louis Puller, Jr., son of the legendary Marine Lieutenant General Louis "Chesty" Puller, stepped on a booby trap on October 11, 1968. The explosion destroyed both his legs, his left hand, part of his right hand, and several fingers. He survived 11 months of surgeries at the Philadelphia Naval Hospital. He was awarded the Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry. In 1994, he put a shotgun to his head and pulled the trigger. He was 48 years old. His suicide note did not mention Vietnam. It didn't have to. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was not formally recognized by the American Psychiatric Association until 1980. Before that, Vietnam veterans suffering from nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, and violent outbursts were diagnosed with adjustment disorders or personality disorders, or nothing at all. The Department of Veterans Affairs denied disability claims. The public dismissed them as weak, as drug addicts, as criminals. The statistics told a different story. By 1980, an estimated 30% of Vietnam veterans met the clinical criteria for PTSD. For combat Marines, the percentage was higher. Some studies suggested 50%. The symptoms were consistent: intrusive memories, avoidance of trauma-related stimuli, negative changes in mood, heightened reactivity. But the real damage was deeper. Vietnam veterans had the highest rates of divorce, unemployment, homelessness, and suicide of any veteran cohort in American history. By 1980, more than 9,000 Vietnam veterans had committed suicide, nearly double the number killed in combat. The number would continue to rise. By 2000, estimates ranged between 50,000 and 100,000 veteran suicides. No one knew the exact number because no one was counting. Then there was Agent Orange. Between 1962 and 1971, the United States military sprayed approximately 20 million gallons of herbicides over Vietnam. The most common was Agent Orange, a mixture of two herbicides contaminated with dioxin, one of the most toxic chemicals ever created. The objective was to defoliate the jungle, to deny the enemy cover. The result was a public health catastrophe. Marines operating in defoliated areas drank contaminated water, ate contaminated food, and breathed contaminated air. The symptoms appeared years later: cancer, diabetes, heart disease, neurological disorders, birth defects in their children. The Department of Veterans Affairs denied the connection for decades. It was not until 1991 that the Agent Orange Act formally recognized the link between herbicide exposure and certain diseases. By then, thousands of veterans were already dead. The public rejection was perhaps the worst wound. Marines returned from Vietnam to a country that did not want them. There were no parades, no celebrations, no acknowledgement of sacrifice. Protesters spat on them in airports. Though the frequency of this has been debated, the perception among veterans was universal. They were told they had lost. They were told they were killers. They were told they should be ashamed. Corporal William Earhart, reflecting years later, said, "We did what our country asked us to do, and when we came home, our country turned its back on us. I will never forgive that." Some veterans adapted. They went to college, started families, built careers. They buried Vietnam deep and never spoke of it. Others could not. They drank. They used drugs. They ended up homeless, living under bridges, wearing pieces of their old uniforms, unable to reconcile the man they had been with the man they had become. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. on November 13, 1982. The wall, as it became known, lists the names of 58,320 Americans killed or missing in Vietnam. Of those, 13,095 were Marines. The dedication was contentious. Some veterans embraced it, others hated it. The design, a black granite wall set into the earth, was called a black gash of shame by critics. But something unexpected happened when veterans visited. They touched the names. They left letters, flowers, dog tags, photographs. They cried. They broke down. And for the first time since returning home, they allowed themselves to grieve. The wall did not heal them, but it acknowledged them. And for many, that was enough. By the 21st century, the perception of Vietnam veterans had shifted. They were no longer pariahs. They were honored, respected, thanked for their service. But the damage had been done. A generation of Marines had given years of their lives to a war their country wanted to forget. And when they came home, they found that they had been forgotten with it. Lewis Puller, Jr., in his Pulitzer Prize-winning memoir, Fortunate Son, wrote, "Vietnam was the defining experience of my generation, and we are still trying to understand what it meant. I do not think we ever will." He was right. It was a war of fire. Napalm falling from the sky, turning jungle into inferno. Villages burning because they might be Viet Cong strongholds. Marines burning their own foxholes with C4 plastic explosive to dry the mud because the rain never stopped. Fire that consumed everything: trees, buildings, bodies, belief. The fire was literal. Operation Zippo, 1965. Marines used flamethrowers to clear bunkers, to burn tunnels, to incinerate anything that could hide an enemy. The M2A17 flamethrower had a range of 40 meters. It took 3 seconds to empty the tank. The operator was a target the moment he ignited it. Life expectancy: minutes. But the fire worked. It cleared fields of fire. It broke enemy morale. It turned men into ash. The fire was also metaphorical, the fever of combat, the burning rage after a friend died, the slow burn of betrayal when the mission changed, when the rules of engagement made victory impossible, when the politicians declared peace but the dying continued. It was a war of doubt. Doubt that the enemy could be identified. Farmers who planted rice by day and fired mortars by night. Children who smiled and waved and led patrols into ambushes. Women who carried grenades in their baskets. The Marines were trained to distinguish combatants from civilians. In Vietnam, the distinction did not exist. Doubt that the mission mattered. Hills taken and abandoned, villages secured and lost, body counts inflated to justify operations that achieved nothing. General William Westmoreland claimed progress. The Marines on the ground saw only repetition. Patrol, ambush, medevac, repeat. Doubt that America cared. Letters from home that described protests, riots, draft card burnings. Journalists who called them killers. Politicians who called the war a mistake. The Marines fought on, not because they believed in victory, but because the man next to them deserved their loyalty. And when that man died, the doubt became certainty. This war was unwinnable, and they were dying for nothing. It was a war that changed America forever. 58,000 Americans dead, 300,000 wounded, millions of Vietnamese dead, soldiers, guerrillas, civilians. No one counted accurately. A country divided, trust in government shattered, the myth of American invincibility destroyed. The Marines bore a disproportionate share of that cost. 13,095 killed, 88,000 wounded, hundreds of thousands more who carried the war inside them for the rest of their lives. Nightmares, flashbacks, survivor's guilt, rage that had no outlet. They were 19 years old when they landed at Da Nang. They were old men when they left. Vietnam exposed the limits of American power. Technology could not defeat ideology. Firepower could not win hearts and minds. Wealth could not buy victory. The richest, most powerful nation on earth could not force a small, poor country to surrender. The Marines learned that lesson in the jungles of Arcor, in the streets of Hue, in the bunkers of Khe Sanh. They learned it in blood, in mud, in the screams of wounded men who would never walk again. And when they came home, they tried to teach America what they had learned. America did not want to listen, but history does not forget. The names on the wall do not fade. The letters written from Vietnam still exist, stored in archives, in attics, in the memories of families who lost sons, brothers, fathers. The photographs remain, black and white images of young men in mud-stained uniforms, staring into the camera with eyes that had seen too much. This is the ugly truth of being a combat Marine in Vietnam. They were sent to fight a war that could not be won, with rules that made victory impossible, for a country that would abandon them the moment they came home. They fought anyway, not for glory, not for ideology, but for each other. And when the war was over, they carried the weight of it alone. The Marine Corps builds warriors. Vietnam tested them beyond breaking. Some survived, some did not. All of them were changed. This is their story. This is their truth. If this history matters to you, if you have a family member who served, if you want to understand what they endured, if you believe their sacrifice should not be forgotten, then subscribe to Vietnam War Archives. Share this video. Leave a comment telling us what this war means to you, or what stories your family carries, because the Marines who fought in Vietnam are disappearing. Every day, more of them die. Their stories die with them unless we preserve them. This channel exists to honor them, to tell their stories, to ensure that the ugly truth is never buried beneath comfortable myths. It was a war of fire. It was a war of doubt. It was a war that changed America forever. And the Marines who fought it deserve to be remembered. Subscribe, share, remember.